Welcome to the Nuance podcast by Marysharon, where we dive deep into the real conversations shaping today's business landscape. I'm your host, Marysharon Owens. In today's episode, we're joined by Mike Adams, whose tenure as a Microsoft executive reveals a powerful truth. Business may be changing, but our character does not have to. Mike's impact across enterprise software solutions for Fortune 50 companies to early stage ventures illuminates a compelling paradox of modern day leadership. While digital transformation, culture, and politics reshape the business landscape, the essence of human potential, our capacity for growth, innovation, and meaningful connection remains remarkably constant. On a personal note, Mike Adams changed my life and has improved the lives of so many he'll never know. I met Mike as an intern when he was a general manager and partner at Microsoft. He wrote an email to Northeastern University stating he was willing to continue the internship co-op program with Northeastern as long as he continued to receive interns like Marysharon Owens. From Mike's perspective, he meant it. He fired off an email and went about his day. What Mike taught me and continues to show his teams is the power we have as individuals to make a difference for our communities. What's more impactful? A straight white male tech exec sending an email to the largest private academic institution on the East Coast, naming a young black female as the linchpin for success? Or performative DEI PR stunts? While Mike's intent wasn't diversity, equity, and inclusion, his impact was. It raises the question, what can each of us do in our day-to-day lives? What small actions can we take that make a big difference in creating the world we want to see? Mike remains one of my closest and most cherished friends to this day. We talk a lot about the state of the world and what we can do as leaders to guide the way forward through diversity, character, and connection. From challenging traditional hiring practices to exploring how microaggressions impact workplace dynamics, Mike and I engage in an honest discussion about what it really takes to build high-performing teams in today's complex business world. Join us. All right, so here's the thing. So we were talking about diversity and kind of unpacking it and, how there are a lot of platitudes, that are being made in this space. A lot of them are negative. A lot of them have very overt racial undertones, racist undertones. And I think what we were talking about is the importance of people's life experiences are different, are much more complex, right, than their phenotype or some of these terms, whether it's black, transgender, whether it's, I'm fluid. There are so many terms now that I think people still want to use to label people. And I feel like we label people to try to streamline our lives. I don't know why it's so important for us to label people.
I think it's how brains work, honestly. I think we need shortcuts to be able to make fast decisions and conclusions. And
right.
So that's the natural thing that's going to happen. And you have to be intentional to cut beyond it.
Well, that's it. And again, I think that goes back to the importance of having them. By the way, I'm getting back into the flow here. So just this will be drunk uncling a little bit. But I think what's we keep coming back to, right, is as a leader, it is important for you to be kind of actively engaged in all of this and not just assuming that, look, if someone's got a problem or if someone's got a feeling, they can just say it. I would. And because that's obviously it's a lazy way of thinking. But I think the irony for me in all of this is that any leader, your job is to get the most out of your team. And whether or not you believe that Marysharon's struggles are legitimate, fundamentally does not matter according to that principle, right? So
that's right. I've got two things I can do. I can create an environment where you can do your best and have the most impact, and I can fire you and replace you with someone else. Those are the things.
That's clean.
That is the job of a people manager, is those two things. It's how do you drive the most possible impact out of a group of people, the group of people that you have,
right, or
that you could have. And so those are the levers, and it's all about those two things.
That's quite the framework. It's pretty simple, but I think what's really key about that is it is simple. You're look, you either get the best of your team or you get rid of people and keep it clean.
Honestly, it's an and. A good manager is going to constantly do some of both.
Well, but what's interesting to me is even I remember when we had the during COVID, right? And there was the rash of Asian hate. And again, it's not like Asian hate has not always been here. I think people just started finally talking about it. The point is, if that person is showing up to work every day and 30% of their thoughts are being consumed with just trying to process what's going on, trying to deal with it, I'm only getting 70% of them. Mm-hmm. And so that's where I struggle with people saying, well, that's not a work issue. Or like, like basically just because you're Asian doesn't mean that that's my problem. Like go talk to your Asian people about that. But because at the end of the day, that flies in the face of me being a leader responsible for getting the most of my team. So the alternative is you create spaces where someone can come into work, sigh heavily, vent. They can just say like, what the fuck is going on? And they can maybe open the door for someone to give them the solace that they need or to listen.
Maybe people can be empathetic and maybe they can make that person feel cared about.
Included.
Because
I think that's what's tough is that it's easy to talk about things that everyone shares. The birth of a child, a divorce. Like I think there are certain things that there are certain pain that all of us share. And I think what's tough about corporate, and I think any of these bigger organizations, for-profit organization, any organization, is that we all feel very comfortable talking about the things that we all share because that's safe, right?
Mm-hmm.
But what we're not well versed on are the things that we don't understand. And so we avoid it. But of course, then what happens? Certain people feel like they can't be themselves because the reality is, if you are a racial minority, or in this case, again, if you're Asian, yeah, you have divorce, you have death, you have birth, you have marriage, you have love, and you have Asian hate. So it's like just being able to talk about the safe stuff is actually excluding people because some people, they really do just get to kind of stick with the general stuff.
I agree. And if someone feels supported and cared for in a time where there's a lot of stress on them because of non-work situations, but they feel like that is a place where not everyone understands, not many people can't relate, but people care.
Yeah.
I think they're going to be more productive there. You've got to create an environment where they have the opportunity. They feel supported enough that they can do their best. And frankly, if their best isn't the best that you could have in that environment with people where they're bringing unique skills, but they're adding to it and making an impact, then they should move on. Right. And like, that's just the reality. That's what business is like. And that's in my view, that's righteous. But if you just say none of those other things even matter and we're not even going to talk about those things at work.
That's your problem.
Yeah, that's just your problem. Like, don't bring that here. We don't want to, like, let's just only ever talk business and not be real with each other about who we are and what we're going through. Like, you're going to get less out of everyone. And you're especially going to get less out of the collective that everyone adds up to.
So that's powerful, what you just said, because how can it kind of conflicts with this idea that we are going to spend a lot of time talking about introverted leaders. We are going to spend a lot of time talking about neurodivergence. The way that you actively engage different types of people, whether it is their neurodivergence, whether it is, different working styles, different geographies, different accents, different backgrounds, it is the same way that you would actively engage about these other topics. Like if you don't have ADHD, you still have to learn about your team members that have it because they bring really special skills to the team and you want to get those skills at their best. So you're going to have to learn as a leader, well, how do I work with this person in order to get their best? It's the exact same thing as saying, well, how do I work with someone of this different racial demographic to get their best? I have to go learn now about their experience. And what's wild to me is like, it should take the same type of approach as a leader. But for some reason, we're like, oh, like skin color and race, nope. We're not going to talk about that, even though it's like, why are we so afraid to do that? But we're really, really proud of ourselves for being like, I'm all about neurodivergence. And let's talk. Like, you know what I mean? It's like that. It's like, it's not like, the reason I'm saying this is because I think for some people, they're like, well, it's a diversity hire. The implication means I have to put in more work to lead this person to get them to where they need to be. That's maybe my editorial on it, but it feels very much like that's the undertone. And it's like, well, that's like saying, I'm hiring an introvert. I'm going to have to do a lot of extra work now to get them to speak more in meetings. Right. It's the same lazy, like you're like, you wouldn't say that.
Maybe some people would say that, honestly. Like maybe they would. But also, like, if that's your mindset, if that's how you're thinking about a diversity and inclusion initiative, you're thinking about it wrong. You're certainly not thinking about it from the same angle that I think about it. The concept of a diversity hire, I'm not saying no organization has ever made a hire for pure, like, number, apparent, measurable diversity reasons of someone who actually is lesser. I'm sure that's happened. And wherever that's happened, those people fundamentally didn't understand diversity the same way I understand diversity. They weren't seeking diversity for the same reasons.
Right. It was just
that on my teams, I'm seeking diversity.
Right.
And if you stick to your network, like, you may hire good people. Will they really be the best? Unless you are explicitly making sure that you're considering candidates who are outside your network, who are different from you, who are different from other people on your team. How do you know? How do you know you're hiring the best? So don't hire a diversity candidate, right?
Well,
don't make a diversity hire. Consider a lot of diverse candidates and make sure that you are hiring on potential based on what challenges people have overcome.
Right.
So that they're going to bring a different way of looking at different challenges from the people you've already have and different from you.
And they're going to work together differently. And the reason I bring this up as a leader is because I think the problem with this idea of a diversity hire, which I hate the phrase, you know that I've led very large teams and I've taken recruiters to task on phrases like, she's a diverse hire. And I'm like, one person by definition cannot be diverse. Rachel, that's a fake name. But the point is that it used to really drive me crazy when they say that, because they'd be like, ooh, I found a diverse hire. And I would just be like, fundamentally, that doesn't make any sense. Also, like, why would you say that to me? Just bizarre. I don't know what it means to them and why they're so excited. But I think what's important, though, is back in the day when we were starting to build consumer experiences, in high tech, in deep tech, and you would have maybe like one designer on a team surrounded by 20 engineers. And the engineers would be like, well, that person's a feeler. Or it'd be like the design team would come in. And I've actually had people say this about my teams when I've come in and created like creative studios or spaces. It's like, I actually remember overhearing someone say, well, you should call Marysharon's team. They do like dance parties and stuff. And it was like, what? Like, what? Just because we're creative, like we do, like what you're basically saying is we're a bunch of clowns in a circus, and you guys do the serious stuff. So when you guys want to have like an innovation workshop,
they might have been saying you were cool.
No,
way cooler than them. I don't know.
I think that in that exact case, they wanted to do like an innovation workshop where they like thought outside the box. And I would like to think that I inspire people to think outside the box. But Marysharon's team does dance parties. It said a lot. And I'm saying that because if you have 20 engineers and there's a dance party dude on the team, as a leader, you are going to have to actually probably engage more actively to ensure that this person is not like the antibody that just kicked out of the organism.
Right.
And that's where I think that diversity programs were powerful, because it might help you. It may help you see that. Whereas I think where a lot of teams and a lot of companies went wrong, especially in like the retail e-commerce world, or in the days of retail e-commerce when it became a thing, was everyone's like, well, whatever. That person's confident. That person's a great guy. This engineer's a great guy. This person's a great guy. It'll be great. And then what happens, right? I mean, look at how many big management consulting firms tried to gobble up creative agencies, and all the top creatives fled the minute like they got their payouts. It's like you do have to learn what types of things to look for. And I do think that's where the program part of DEI was powerful, because you're like, oh, I guess I never thought about that. And you shouldn't have to like go through it and fail in order to learn these things if the knowledge is available to us. But I feel like that's not how people talk about DEI programs. And I think that's the risk you run then. Good people are going to flee because they are a minority in the context.
And it's so important that you understand the input metrics that will lead to you doing things the right way.
Right. And
in
what is your
order
working
to
thesis?
Get to value.
Right.
And there's fundamental misalignment, misunderstanding in what the value proposition of diversity is, what the value proposition of inclusion is. And if we had more conversations about that.
Right.
And I tell you, I've tried in, lots of different cases in social media and things like that with people that I know.
Right.
Who end up then not wanting to have a logical argument and instead saying, those are great buzzwords, Mike. Really love your virtue signaling. And when somebody says that, and you know, I hate the way these terms get used and abused.
Right.
Like, okay, I am a leader in business. How would you like me to signal? Like, isn't signaling from a leader actually important? Like, if a leader isn't signaling to a group of people how they think, what they expect, then what are they doing? So if I shouldn't be signaling virtue, what should I be signaling?
Wow.
Like, I don't do it. I know what it means. What it's supposed to mean is that you don't really mean it. That you're just signaling, right? And it's just talking points, but you don't actually feel it, think it, back it up. And hey, if that's what people mean by this, then I agree. Empty talking points, no value, you know.
Right. It's like that phrase sustainable business. Like
but
when that was the thing.
People use that as a weapon. Like, you shouldn't be talking and signaling about things that are good and positive for people, society, right, business. Like, seriously, that isn't what we all should be striving to signal to each other all the time, is positive virtue? I don't understand.
Well, and then
that
you really
I don't
can't,
understand.
But that's power. I mean, there are so many bombs you just dropped there. That was powerful. But I think you bring up a very good point where it's saying that word positive is important. And I say this as someone with a master's in positive psychology. So obviously this one's I got a lot of bias around it. But the word positive, right, by definition means to build. It is not to be superficially optimistic. It is not to be like happy and shiny, ignoring all the problems. It is not to be someone who just doesn't want to deal with the hard stuff. Being positive is to be constructive. And so every team should have to determine what is being constructive in this context. And it's everything. It's the vibes, it's the culture, it's the vision, it's the governance. And I think you're right. Like, we kind of are like, oh, once you start veering into certain things, then it's like, okay, that's just like diversity theater. Mike is a 6'4" white guy who's just trying to look like, you know, he's Mr. Cool Boy, but we're running a business here, Mike. But you're like, actually, it's about how is this team going to win? How's this team going to be constructive? And how are we going to sustain that?
And how are we going to become better over time? Yeah. And my fundamental framework is systems theory. And these systems are complex. Humans are complex. Groups of humans that you're trying to drive are complex. And therefore, like, you really have to have deeper conversations. You can't just use these buzzwords. You have to talk about what things mean.
In that context.
And why they matter.
Right.
In order for people to understand how you're thinking about the whole system, how it's supposed to work. And that's why you can't just pick a measure and go, oh, hit this goal, because that is what people will do, and they will do the wrong thing to hit a measure if you're too focused on the measure without talking about the entire system, the inputs as well as those outputs. And the inputs are actually the things that really matter. And when it comes to diversity, the input of casting that wide net when you're recruiting someone else is so important. From an inclusivity standpoint, the people on your team being different, super hard to measure. How do you measure that?
Right. Right.
It's totally inaccurate to think you can just measure ethnicity and that is going to show you whether your team is diverse or isn't diverse.
Or is performing or isn't performing.
But my gosh, if everybody has the same background, if everyone looks the same, if you're all over 6 foot white guys,
with gorgeous hair.
I think, well, even if some of you have crew cuts and some of you have luxurious locks, it doesn't matter. But I mean, how can you possibly argue that team is the best? How do you know
that's quite
that team is the best?
That's a call out. It's a call out. And I think also it just goes to the systems thinking is so universal. because every system will have unique inputs and outputs by definition in order to be competitive. You cannot create systems that will have the same outputs as everybody else. And therefore, logically speaking, the inputs should have to be different. And so the more interesting, novel, strategic inputs you can get from your own team, that's how you future-proof your company, right? It's just, I don't think we're talking about it as a systems conversation. We're talking about it in terms of like, old-timey historical debates that have been going on in this country since the beginning of its formation, and we're not getting anywhere.
We're just it's emotion and defensiveness.
Yeah.
And frankly, there's a lot of selfishness and a lot of win-lose mindset.
Right.
Of in order for someone to win, someone else has to lose. And sure, there's micro examples of that all over the place.
Right.
But macro, when you're looking at a system, it is not a win-lose proposition.
It's an ongoing.
And when you look at society, when you look at business, it's not win-lose. Sure, you look at a particular deal.
That's a really good point.
That one company is vying for another company's business, and you've got competitors. One of you is going to win that particular deal.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that everything is lost. There is so little that is actually so black and white win-lose.
That's important too, because I think that even with what's going on in the rhetoric of, mainstream media, politics, whatever, it's very much like even like the affirmative action mess, right? Last year. And it was like, we won, like we finally won. Like there's no more affirmative action. And you're like, slow, like congratulations. Well, I don't know what the fuck you think you won. But it's like, I think that it is becoming this like silly game. And when you play silly games, you win silly prizes. Like, it's just like, okay, but you can feel it, right? It's like whether it's women's rights or it's like, we won, like DEI is gone. Like, it's just, you can get that feeling. And you're like, to your point, the world was spinning before we got here. It's going to be spinning when we leave. Business is going to continue. That was a silly prize. Like, you still have to be competitive. You still have to build your business. You still have to bring on new consumers.
And what did you win? I fundamentally ask. So you're saying we shouldn't have inclusion. Like, is that the conversation?
Is that what you're proud of?
People shouldn't feel included. They shouldn't feel a part of something. They shouldn't feel like they themselves can bring themselves and feel like they are an important part of that business, of that team, of that system. Like, we're against including people? Well, is that what we're against?
The absurdity, of course, is then what you're saying is, as a leader, you're like, I don't need to help people be inclusive. They can be inclusive on their own. And that's when you say it that way, it sounds absolutely ridiculous as a leader.
Pretty silly.
As a leader, right? Because you're like, people will just learn how to include themselves. It's not my problem. And you're like, actually, if you're running
this is a business. Like, a lot of people will say, well, this is a business. This isn't fun time.
Right.
Yeah,
dance party time.
So,
but
we're not hosting an interstellar keg party here.
But it's like, you're basically just saying, I no longer have to be an exemplary leader. I get to go back to now just being like a mediocre leader, and I win. And that's, to me, is how I hear all of this screaming about DEI. And I'm like, that's such a self-report.
And there are other people, though, who will hear it as life just got simpler.
Right.
Like, we don't have to worry about those things.
Great.
But life didn't get simpler.
Ooh.
Life is the same as it was before. And it's a matter of, what are we trying to accomplish here?
Well, and what's simpler?
What do you think what do you think actually drives business results? And how does that work?
And again, is it simpler to feel like there's less friction day to day and watch your business slowly go down the bell curve? Is that simpler? And I think actually for some people it is, right? Because in a big organization, you can place blame in a lot of places when things aren't going right. I want to talk about your internship program, though, because it is so different and it was so impactful. And I think in ways that you probably didn't even know at the time. But, most companies in the Fortune 100 have internship programs. They have rotation programs, right? Where the idea is you bring in the younger talent. So from what I understand, even though Microsoft did have several, classic, well-run internship kind of playbooks, right? You work here for 3 months, you come from a great school, often the same schools, you have certain majors. And again, it's like people come in for the summer and then they're gone. And you were like, yeah, no, actually, if we're going to do an internship program, we're going to basically socially engineer it so that it's going to mean something for all of us. Like everyone's going to win. And so the way that I understood the internship program was it was 6 months instead of 3. And I think the idea there was that you're like, look, after 3 months, everyone forgets that you're an intern. And so we need to really know if you're going to work out well in this organization.
I think that was part of it. And I think the other part was how meaningful an impact can you make in 3 months? That includes ramp up, acclimation, and, then understanding context and getting to the real work, then delivering a deliverable that can be incorporated and measured,
right,
where we really know whether it was successful or not. It's super hard to do in 3 months. And I'm not saying it can't be done, but that was the idea that we were experimenting with back then was, what if it was 6 months instead of 3 months?
Right. So I'll do a quick list of what I think the novel differences were. Where it was a 6-month internship instead of 3. Every intern had to have every intern role was essentially there was a full-time role available for that intern. So basically, it was up to the intern to screw it up, and so there was motivation there.
There was commitment to a full-time role.
Commitment to a full-time role. So you could not have an intern on your team unless you had a full-time role for that intern to take when they graduated. Every intern had to have a mentor, with the twist is that the intern's performance showed up on the mentor's annual review. So again, commitment, a lot of commitment. And then each intern, I believe that we were working for one of your direct reports, and we had to work on one of your top initiatives. And so what that really meant in practice was I worked on the most important projects in your organization. And so, of course, then what? We all come back as an internship class, and the youngest people in your organization know just as much as your most senior people on these topics, which I think is brilliant.
I think the other thing was how we decided on the projects in the first place.
Okay.
That it was really part of my belief is that you can start with a theory of scarcity, or you can start with a theory of plenty. And I wanted to create a dynamic of scarcity where interns were a scarce resource that the organization was different leaders in the organization were vying for interns on their team working on their project, because we had the dynamic of we had way more top priorities than we could possibly accomplish.
Okay.
And so we had a certain number of interns, and basically we had a Shark Tank like process before I would have used the term Shark Tank because the show didn't exist then. But
you had to pitch.
For folks to pitch and vie for an intern to work on their project. And it was a big deal to be able to get an intern on your team. It wasn't the philosophy of plenty would be, we've got 20 interns who are starting. What are they going to do?
Who wants one?
Yeah, who wants one? Sign up and have your intern to go help. Or you can start saying, we're only going to have a few interns, and we've got to make sure that we put them on things where you need help and they're going to make a difference. You aren't getting a full-time employee position for this. So you better make sure, because this is an important project that has to get done. If you get an intern, you're going to then be able to move forward
because of that intern.
Where for 6 months, you've got this, what if we've done a good job is going to be somebody really strong, really motivated, who's going to make a difference. You've got to come and pitch. What is the impact that they're going to make? Why should it be on your project?
It's brilliant because also, a lot of people are like, it's an intern. And a lot of the reasons I think, interns probably spend so much of their time in the break room is because no one wants to take the time to help them ramp up. For many reasons, right? One is because, maybe the the expertise gap is too wide, or it's like, this person's going to be gone in 2 months. Like, I don't have time for this. And so what you're saying is like, no. You are working on something that is so important that if you fail, it's going to be a problem.
That's right.
So you are telling me that you need help. What are you going to do with this intern? Like, explain to me why this intern is going to help you. But you're right. It's like, if you really do need the intern, then you're going to do what you need to do to get that intern up to speed and to start adding value as quick as possible.
Yeah. And you're right when you said earlier that we had to be planning that if the intern does well, we were going to hire them. Like we had to have enough, have confidence. We'd have enough positions, which wasn't like we were getting additional positions,
right,
full-time positions to hire interns into. It was a matter of workforce planning and figuring how many folks you would be able to hire, and then committing, if this person does as well as we expect, then we are going to hire them onto this team. And that's why it was so important that the manager of the intern and the mentor of the intern were both measured based on the success of the intern. And it wasn't so that they wouldn't get knocked down if we'd made a bad intern hire. Some of those are gonna happen. Right.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't to induce stress.
Right. And it wasn't to make a bad hire, for God's sake. The last thing we would want to do is have someone who really wasn't all that great.
Like a diversity hire?
An intern, then the term would be intern hire, and nobody would want one of those. And so it was really important that they were putting the effort in to give that intern every chance to be successful. So that's why they were measured on the success of the intern.
The makeup of our class was very diverse in probably every way of measuring that term, right? I mean, it was racial diversity. We came from universities all over the country. We had different majors. We had different focus areas.
It wasn't the typical just everybody's a computer science from one of the top computer science schools.
Right.
It was we were going for differences because we had a lot of computer science employees from the top computer science schools.
Right. And so weirdly, though, I don't think we came in feeling like, oh, God, why did they hire us? Is it because we aren't computer? I mean, I was an MIS major. I don't even know if that degree exists anymore in the School of Business. But my point is, when we came in, it felt so important to do well because there was a full-time job at Microsoft on the line. Like, that's a big deal.
And there was a project,
all your loans.
And there was a project where you understood the business impact that was expected.
Yes.
Coming out of that, and you were working as an employee side by side with other employees, and you understand what customers that would impact.
Well, here's why that was powerful too, and I'm going to give Julie Harris a shout out in this podcast, as I probably should every podcast. But so Julie was an executive on our team, and I remember the reason I think what you said is important is because I watched very senior people busting their asses. Like, I watched very senior people working to their most extreme high performance because these projects were so important. So then here I am, 21 years old. That's my bar now. What I think is normal working was actually like the highest of the highest performers of like the smartest people arguably in the world. And so I remember one time I remember at like intern housing in those like townhomes in Redmond. And I remember sending Julie Harris an email at like 2:30 in the morning. And I felt like such a badass because I was like, look at me, like working so hard. And Julie responded like 5 minutes later.
Well, that
it's also very Julie Harris.
Also is a little too Julie.
But I think the point was, I was like, wow. It was not like we were killing ourselves and our bosses, like checking with our bosses and showing our homework. It was like we were actually part of the team and we had just as much responsibility. And it was like trying to learn really fast what it meant to be a winner in a group of winners. It wasn't like I was working for maybe like a lower level manager who didn't have that type of expertise. I mean, this was it. And so then we graduate and we think that's the bar. And the reason I bring that up is because if you look where a lot of us ended up 2 or 3 years later.
Mm-hmm. In a whole lot of different places. It's not like in the same team, working the same way.
No.
Yeah.
By architecting the program this way, obviously I would like to think that your organization benefited, but we did too in ways that, have been countless. And so and especially, as a Black female coming into business, talking the way that I did was powerful, even in jobs after Microsoft, because it's like what I was used to was talking to C-level officers in a Fortune 50 company. That was my norm. And so it did, I think, give me a level of credibility that maybe people would not have given me had they just looked at me.
And let me ask you, we didn't have a whole lot of young Black females on the team. What did you learn about other humans by working on that team of folks who had a very different profile from you, but also we had a lot of people who had similar profiles to each other?
That's really interesting. Well, it's interesting for a couple of reasons. Number one, I grew up building computers with my dad. So he was an IBM exec. Like literally back when you could stand in the computer equipment and assemble them with your hands. My dad and I actually built my computer going to college too, which was like a great father-daughter moment. So weirdly, I think that I have a background in tech that runs really deep, because both my parents were in tech. My mom was a consultant at Keen and she was a programmer, and my dad was so I think that actually felt weirdly familiar because I was working with a bunch of old people in tech, and I grew up with that at the dinner table. So I think that was one thing. I think the other thing that was also different was I did grow up in an all-white world. I did grow up in Woodbury, Minnesota. So not even like Minneapolis. I literally grew up in a town with a farm 2 houses down, and it was a really big deal when we got a Target Greatland, which was very cool. But I'm saying that because I don't know that people all looking the same was as much of a factor for me in terms of it feeling different. Mm-hmm. But what was powerful was, I think that it was a plus and a minus maybe, but I learned, for better or for worse, how people perceived me. So I learned, which is again sometimes heartbreaking and sometimes it was uplifting, but I would hear people ask me questions like, so when you go home for Christmas, are you going to see your mom or your dad? Why would, and is it wrong? But is it wrong to come from a single, family household? Of course not. But I just heard you ask Jeff if he's going to go home and see his parents. And so, and I think actually this is a side tangent. Wow. When people talk about microaggressions, this is exactly what they're talking about. When people talk about there's this whole conversation about.
It's such a weird assumption. My mind is still blown that you would have.
But it happens several times in one 1 hour meeting.
Yeah.
And of course, I'm the only one that's picking up on it. They're not. They actually think, that they probably are going home thinking, you know what? I spent some time today and I asked this Black girl on my team. I wanted her to feel included. So I was asking her, what are you going to do for the holidays? And really, the whole thing was destroyed by what question you asked me. And it is funny, right? But the reality is, and I know that you get this too, is that obviously there's a lot when people have the power and influence, and they're the ones making derogatory assumptions about you. That sucks because I'm a systems thinker too.
Yeah.
And I can see pretty clearly how, gosh, if I don't walk into every meeting and I don't proactively overcome certain assumptions people have, then I'm actually going to be left behind, or I'm not going to advance as fast as I want to advance. And that was really important because I think a lot of us coming into corporate environments who don't look the part, it's like you're canoeing through a fog. You're like, I don't understand why I'm not getting ahead. I don't understand why it seems like these other people that are really mediocre are advancing when actually I'm smarter or I'm doing more work. And if I hadn't had those experiences as an intern where I'm like, it's not about my smarts. It's just that and this has happened to me at other companies as well, which is one of the reasons I did start my own company. It's just constantly being in the room where people are like, hey, thanks so much for the printouts. And it's like, I didn't make the printouts. I'm not the admin on this team. I'm actually a senior director. Who the hell are you? It didn't bowl me over. Right.
Well, let's go back to think back to your internship. I'm super curious, and I don't know at the time whether we talked about these things or not, but did you, over the course of your internship, become more comfortable speaking up about those microaggressions?
That's a really good point.
And, and how do you think that helped other people, caused conflict? What do you think happened?
I'm really glad you brought that up because, again, I had being naive on my side. So this was my first real, kind of corporate serious environment. I'd worked in startups in my last 2 co-ops before that. And so because it was an engineering culture Because, I mean, look, let's be real. There were plenty of people on the spectrum, different maybe degrees of it, but it was very literal culture.
Before we used that term, yes.
Before we used that term, people were just very literal, we'll put it that way. And so because I maybe didn't know any better, and because I also did grow up kind of with an engineering mindset of, you know how you have to be very specific when you're building stuff? Like,
clarity.
Clarity is key. And so when you're working on something where like at the end of the day, you flip the switch and it works or not, specifics are always your friend. And so I think what I would see is like, okay, you made a really weird assumption about me. I'm going to be specific because maybe I really did believe that a lot of them didn't realize what they were doing or saying. And I really wanted, to your point about caring, because we were in a very caring organization. I actually cared about these people and I wanted them to not keep doing that because I knew that if they knew it, they'd be mortified. But also, these were really cool, powerful people that had a lot of influence. And so I thought, if I actually can just go out a little further on the skinny branch and tell you how I feel, or, hey, you said this is how I interpreted it. Is that what you meant? Because, heck, maybe one of them thought that they heard me say that my parents aren't together. I don't know. Either way, because what I learned is it doesn't change your approach. Whether or not someone meant it, whether or not the bias was real, does not change my approach. My approach should be, hey, and the reason it's important is because if I don't tell you and I just bottle it up, I'm no longer as effective as I would be. It would just be ruminating in my head all day, right? If I don't get it out in that moment, it's unfair because you're going to go about your day and I'm going to go back to my desk feeling like I'm like, what the fuck, man, this world sucks. And so it was almost like, hey, this sounds funny and it sounds a bit dramatic, but I think this is very true, which is why the internship program, the way that you structured it was important, was like, I don't have time for this. I don't have time to feel sorry for myself or to be distracted. You had stuff
you had to get done in that 6 months.
I did. I wanted that job.
Or there was not going to be a job.
And I had loans. Like this is a big deal, right? And so I think that sounds a bit funny, but again, we were also working in a lot of really innovative stuff. We were working on like startup ventures. This wasn't like some of the product groups where they had these like 2-year ship cycles and every day mattered and every conversation you had mattered. And so if I wasn't fully present, I knew that it was going to actually put my job at risk. So because of that, I think because of all of it, I'd be like, why do you think my parents aren't together? And I wouldn't be mean about it because that's also me growing up in an environment where I'm used to this. Like I'm used to people saying things that are wildly offensive.
Sometimes people you care about who care about you and don't realize.
Me because there was not enough time, because the opportunity was so great, because I felt like being an intern was actually really important. I never felt like I was a junior person on the team because in the way that you described the internship program, we were like cherished. And so I felt I had a responsibility, like every other member on the team, to help the team be better. But I also did have the privilege of working with some of the smartest people in the world. Like this wasn't like an average organization. It wasn't like a company that hired average people.
Right.
And so when you work with smart people, you do have the benefit of them oftentimes being curious and actually liking to think. That sounds funny, but like if I give you something to think about, smart people are often like, hadn't thought about that. And so I think a lot of those things came together. But then when I would say it, I started to see that there weren't consequences that I might have been afraid of. And at a very young age, I got to see that like, hey, if I do say something, it's not like all of a sudden I'm blacklisted and I'm now going to be, dismissed, or I'm not going to be invited to meetings anymore, or people aren't going to be afraid to talk to me because Marysharon just brought up race. It didn't happen that way. And when I would bring it up, people were like, but I think what saved us in that environment was because I wasn't like, hey, man, that's really offensive that you think that I just grew up in a broken home. What does that mean? It was like, hey, you just said something that's really stupid, and I don't want you to look stupid anymore. And so I want to make sure that you know that when you say these things, you really sound stupid. And no one in that organization wanted to sound stupid, right? Everyone prides himself on being smart. I think for me, the question is, how did you create a space where I did feel so safe doing that? Because I certainly have worked in other companies where there's no effing way that I would have even challenged it. I would have just blown it off because it wouldn't be worth.
I think I gotta do the thing where I turn it around on you and go, what was it about that environment that made you feel safe?
I'll tell you
why. Because the goal was to create a safe environment for each of you. I mean, for all of the employees, but specifically worried about these interns who were coming in. And that's why we made sure that they had the support around them. But we didn't know. And I don't even know that we were clinical enough about diagnosing whether we were doing a good enough job of creating a place where you could thrive.
Yeah, and I don't even know if you were consciously like, we are going to create safe spaces.
We never would have used those terms.
Right.
But the create a place where you are going to be able to show whether at your best,
I like that,
you could deliver the impact that we were going to need. Like the objective of the internship program was, there were a couple there. One was it was an actual real business project that had to go well. These weren't made up extra things. Yeah, they were my top projects.
Right.
And there were real roles on those projects. And there were things that we were having trouble funding and having the right skill set and people for. So that was one thing. Another thing was we wanted it to create an influx of energy into the org with younger folks that we were going to hire who would raise the game of everybody on the team. And then third, we did care that it was going to be an experience that would grow each of you.
Yeah.
That would help you grow, and that would hopefully mean that it would accelerate your growth and that you would come back to Microsoft with a great trajectory and an acceleration, because that was going to be good for you and good for us. Again, it's not a win-lose. It's a win-win.
Okay, and I'm gonna put it back on you. But I think
I'm doing too good a job teaching.
It's a great segue because it goes to show the importance of the little things, right? And what I'm about to do is explain why you shouldn't have to rely on programs to achieve powerful objectives, right? So the answer to your question is the reason that I felt comfortable doing it is because you went out of your way to actively engage with us. And, you were a GM at the time. I mean, you were a partner in the company. And so I think we had not monthly meetings, but maybe we had 2 meetings with you or something during the internship program. I know we had a lunch that was a really big deal. And I remember Papa Rick Stover made sure that we all prepared for that lunch and didn't, that we all had interesting questions to ask Mike and, made sure that we understood.
Sounds like Rick.
Totally, Papa Rick. But made sure that we understood when your GM asks you out to lunch, it's not because he just wants to hang out. This is your opportunity to have a strategic conversation with her. So we were coached. And I think that when you say caring, I don't think that you told Rick he had to do that.
No.
I mean, and so I think I would see that.
But it would have not reflected very well on him if it had gone really poorly. So
back to that systematic loop.
Exactly.
But again, everyone was so invested that I felt I needed to be too, because I was seeing it left and right. And then you would have you would have our one-on-one with you. I'd have our one-on-one with you. And you would be like, how are things going? You'd ask me about my mentor. You'd ask me about my manager. And then I learned too, this is an open door organization.
And I would have an opinion about your work because I remember that.
But I do think that it was easing your way into creating an opportunity to say, hey, can I give you feedback? But you were my leader, so you were going to give me feedback. I didn't actually think that I had a choice. But I think that because the way you went about asking these questions and giving the feedback felt like someone who really wanted to understand so that they could articulate to other people, including who they were talking to, how to do better and get more of what they want, not just less of what they don't want. And that's actually a really important point that I wanted to double down on. I don't feel like in our organization you were ever trying to get people from negative to neutral. I feel like you were always trying to get people into the positive, above neutral, which means a lot of feedback. So to answer your question, I think it just felt like that is what leaders look like. And I will say that that isn't really what a lot of people get to experience in their careers is those are compliment sandwiches, the passive aggressive, I'm going to ask you a question that makes me sound like I really care about you, but that I don't. People can pick up on that.
Sure.
I just don't think any of your leaders, your direct reports were like that either. It was a very honest organization.
And you said something that I think is really important there, the negative to neutral versus somewhat positive to extremely positive.
Yeah.
And that is a philosophy I have, and I think it's really important, is if all you do is focus on like polishing up your weaknesses, like all you're ever going to be is average.
Yeah.
And when you look at the composition of a team, one of the reasons why it's so important to have people who are different is something that's super hard to measure, but people have different strengths.
Yep.
I really do believe that for a personal, individual optimal performance, like sure, if you've got glaring weaknesses that make you fail, fix them. But primarily your performance focus should be take the things that really are your strengths, figure out how to get in a position that leverages those and really work on your strengths. And I try to give people constructive feedback on their strengths,
right?
Not just on their weaknesses. And then when you turn that into a team of many people, making sure the work groups have people with different strengths so that they add up together to something bigger than any of them could have been individually. And if you create the environment where they feel comfortable, feel safe, feel included,
right,
then they actually will lean on each other because they don't feel like they're competing with each other, with their teammates, but they'll lean on each other and make up for each other's weaknesses.
So there's two things really quickly that I want to, the nuance, if you will. So two things. You are very easy to read. That's a compliment, right? No,
at times.
I think,
sometimes you make those faces and being easy to read might not be optimal, but.
Yes, I did one time have in my review that Marysharon provides real-time feedback with her faces, or with her face in meetings, and that was an opportunity for me to work on. That actually was really written in one of my reviews. But I think the reason I say that is because if someone said something, and I saw this, and again, as a young person, if someone said something that changed your thinking or challenged what your assumption, like your working thesis, you would actually audibly go, oh. And we'd watch you be like, huh, yeah, that's right. And it's like we could all hear your gears turning, and then we would go on. I once heard from a leader, the hardest part about getting to the C-suite is that the higher you go, there's more landmines and less resources. And so people, I think, out of fear, start to become really cagey. And they, I think, are nervous, right, about putting blood in the water. Like, oh, I didn't know something. Mm-hmm. I think on your team, the going in assumption is that you're working with the smartest people in the world. Of course you don't know what they know. Otherwise, why would you both be here? So it was like assumed that no one really knew everything.
Yeah.
So the going in assumption is that every time you talk to someone, you're going to walk away knowing something more, or you're going to change your thinking. That is not the norm. And so again, I think it's because of actually just who you are. I think it's your nature. Like you're a naturally curious person. Like every time I walk in your office, you'd be reading some cool book. I mean, the fact that we talk about Thomas Jefferson's Bible, you're like, hey, have you read that? Like, I think learning was a part of the gig, but it wasn't like you gave us, like, it wasn't like everyone here has 50 hours to go learn in a training program, and I want you to all make sure that you get those 50 hours in. It just was so part of the dialogue. So I do think that was powerful without maybe you being aware of it, because that is very unique. That is not something I've seen everywhere.
Thank you. I mean, I do believe that, like, that I say, I feel and I try to show. Like,
you do.
I am really smart. I have confidence in the fact that I am smart. I know very little.
But that's
because there is so much to know.
Right.
That of course I know very little, and so do every one of you.
Right.
Like I have worked with some of the smartest, most successful, richest people ever on the face of the planet, and they are really smart. They're not necessarily any smarter than me. They know really important things, that some of which are very different things from what I know. And then there's a whole bunch of shit I know more about than them.
The second thing I want to just touch upon is that word strengths. So again, and I say this as, the world of positive psychology introduced, like strengths finder, like all of that kind of came as like, we should really soar with our strengths. And I think what's important about the strengths you're talking about they're closer to what I would describe as like the strengths that you can find, the character strengths and like the Values in Action Institute. So Penn actually did a lot of work with them too. But the theory here is that researchers kind of went around the world and they just asked heads of nations, heads of tribes, heads of families, what are like the top virtues and values that you respect and love about people? And interestingly, they came up with like 24, like around the world. It all kind of culminated on these 24. And it's like the kind of strengths that can never be taken away from you. It's like the strengths that when you describe a friend or someone you really care about, you'll lead with it. So it's like capacity for kindness, capacity to love and be loved, bravery, wisdom, prudence, appreciation of beauty. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because I think when you say, I want someone to soar with their strengths, it wasn't like Marysharon is the most strategic person on this team. Like you wouldn't believe the decks that she creates. And the reason that that's also powerful.
Yeah, it wasn't great at PowerPoint.
Yeah, but here's the thing, right? A lot of people I think as a leader, if I give compliments, and people will know that I care about them. But what they've shown in these studies is like, okay, so if I say, hey, Mike, awesome deck, you crushed it. 20 minutes later, I've completely forgotten about that, compliment. It's like having ice cream on a hot day. Like, it's like, that was nice. That's
right.
Happiness, right? That's just like a quick flash in the pan. If I say, hey, Mike, thanks for speaking up in that meeting before anyone else did, because did you notice when you spoke up first, so-and-so and so-and-so also spoke up, and I don't think we would have gotten to the right solution had they not. So thanks for going first. Thanks for being brave. You're going to walk out of that meeting feeling like you are appreciated for who you are in what you do.
Right.
And most people forget the who you are part.
That's really interesting.
But I think you do it naturally, and you use that word strengths, but I think teasing it out is really important because there are some strengths frameworks that a lot of companies use where it's like strategic is your strength. And I've been on a strategy team where one of the people in the room, that was not one of his top 5 strengths. That sucks. That's shame. That's dangerous. You can't go wrong with character strengths. And what people will do is they will run through fire for teams that when they feel like, you're right, like maybe I do talk too much and maybe I do ramble, but I love to go first. I want to be the one smashing down the walls and taking all the hits, and you guys can go in after me. Some people, like, that is how they feel most alive.
Well, and the way I heard you say that, it sounded like you were talking about someone who said, like, the way our team sees themselves is that these are our strengths as a team. And then if the expectation from that is inferred that you expect those strengths to be the strengths of every person on the team, like,
what's the point?
How is that team better because those people are together? Like, they could all just they're all just
right.
interchangeable.
But that's what happens.
And what's the value of a team of interchangeable people?
People talk about, again, it's like, oh, that person's a feeler. That person's a thinker. And there are these character strengths that people bring on a team. Some people are just like, they give the best pep talks. They just do. Like, they seem to really actually be excited about what's so great about people, and they can't shut up about it. And like, having worked on startups, that person is really important because, thinking only gets you so far. And you can, if your thinking overshadows your relationships, if it starts to overshadow other things, the thinking actually is not problematic. Mm-hmm. The character strengths that people bring in are just as important as the skill sets. And yes. I also do think to bring it around kind of full circle, when we talk about diversity and we talk about people's life experiences through their character strengths, I do wonder if that's where it starts to get interesting. Because like my top strengths, I think when I took that test, it was like bravery. Wisdom, and my like lowest. And it's not that I don't have these. It's that I didn't necessarily lean in with them at the time. And this is embarrassing to admit, but I'll go first. It was capacity for kindness and the capacity to love and be loved, which sounds horrible. But the truth is, if I look back and why I've been hired on most teams, what have my nicknames been? The Fixer. Like, I've had these nicknames where you're like, and then a really fun exercise, by the way, if you want to try it, and for anyone listening, it's to send an email or a text to like 5 to 10 people that have known you in your life, whether it's colleagues or friends, and just ask a very simple question of, can you just give me like 3 stories of a time in your life where I added value? Like, don't lead it. And when I did this, it was funny because, again, everyone thinks certain things of themselves. My friends were like, I remember that time in college when you like drove like your Hyundai, which is like the the lights didn't work, the heat was broke. We had to keep the car in 6th gear by using a lanyard like attached to the glove compartment. I mean, it was risky. And this is like pre-cell phones. And they're like, yeah, but you did it because you wanted to go work in this like tech startup in San Francisco. Like you just got in the car and went. And all of the examples my friends were giving me, even my colleagues, it was like, yeah, there was this one time that you had my back in a meeting and nobody else would. And like, it really meant a lot to me. And so you started to see what people value about me is more my character strengths.
Right.
And these are colleagues and friends. And all I said was, just tell me a time I added value. And so I think what is really fascinating about this, and my point in all this is I don't think that you called them character strengths. I think that you did talk, I think that you were trying to create environments where this was unearthed and where people appreciated character as much as skill set.
It's really interesting because it's one of the greatest things I worry about today.
Which is what?
Is whether character is valued at the level that it should be.
I would argue that it's not. I think decency flew out the window a long time ago.
I do think that character and leaders leading with character is the most important thing.
I mean, I know my dad and I were talking about this. He's a PhD in education and he's a business professor. And he was like, look, when it really comes down to business, it's not about your strategy. It's literally just vision, culture, and governance. And without character, I don't know how any of that stuff becomes sustainable in a constructive way. You can always have governance, right? You can always have rules. But if the people enforcing the governance have no character, I mean, I think we see.
And when you're under pressure, when you're challenged, when you're threatened, like character is what you fall back on.
Yeah, it is.
And it's what you need people on your team to fall back on, is a strength of character.
Thank you for listening. I hope there were a few sentiments worth sharing.